All right. Welcome everyone. Happy Monday. Hope everyone's surviving well. So as you know, today's class is slightly different. We're in a new Zoom room, new link, and thanks to the sponsorship of the Studio for Creative Inquiry, we're able to have Dr. Chad Shomura with us today as part of CMU's Steiner Speaker Series. Before I introduce Dr. Shomura, a few friendly reminders. So this lecture is being recorded. I know that the past lectures have been recorded as well. This one's a little different since it'll be shared with the wider CMU community. So the lecture portion will be recorded. And so during the lecture, if you have any questions or thoughts that come to mind, please add them to the chat. So we'll reference them during the Q&A, which is when we won't be recording it, at least for the wider CMU community. So any questions before we begin? Okay, great. So I am so thrilled and so excited to welcome Dr. Chad Shomura here with us today. Dr. Shomura is a theorist, an educator based in Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute territory known as Denver, Colorado. I hope I pronounced those correctly. He is assistant professor of political science at the University of Colorado, Denver. He researches and teaches political theory, American studies, and feminist and queer theory. Dr. Shomura's work focuses on affect and politics at the intersections of race, sexuality, coloniality, species, and materiality. He is currently working on a book, writing a book called A Life Otherwise. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll pass it on to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Esther. And thank you so much for the wonderful invitation to join your class. I also want to thank Marisol and Hajira for welcoming me into the space. And thank you to all the students who are joining today. I know I gave you a bit of homework to do, and so hopefully that was okay. But you'll see why as we proceed with the talk. And I look forward to our discussion afterwards. I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from, as Esther mentioned, from the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute territories known as Denver, Colorado. And I acknowledge that the Carnegie Mellon University is in the territories of the Osage and Shawnee peoples. And I think this kind of line acknowledgement is really important to the kind of work that we do. I know that in this class, you're exploring notions like intersectionality. And part of the framework of intersectionality is understanding the ways in which colonialism has shaped the worlds in which we live and the lands upon which we speak. So I'll start sharing my screen now. So the title of my talk today is We Care, Therefore We Survive: Public Feelings, Minor Feelings, and the Politics of Care. So today I'm going to talk about the relationship between publics, politics, and feelings. I will focus on the construction of publics and public discourse through the exclusion of feelings, especially those of people and of women of color. And I'll discuss a couple of projects that try to open up space for public feelings. I'll discuss how these kinds of projects are needed for more equitable and just models of care. And then I'm hoping that in our discussion period that follows, that we can sort of really focus the place of feelings and care, and that we can integrate your folks' interests in design. So I'm going to begin by talking about the dominant Eurocentric view of feelings, which devalues them, gives them very little public space, and holds them to be antithetical to sound political activity. I think this talk will run for maybe about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have about half an hour, I think, for Q&A afterwards. So feelings have been devalued throughout the history of Western thought. Many feminists trace the origins of this stance to 17th century philosopher René Descartes. Descartes is most well known for his formulation: I think, therefore I am. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. Even if you haven't read something by Descartes, you probably have heard this phrase. Now, Descartes believed that while he could doubt the existence of the material world, he could not doubt his own existence as a thinking being. Descartes concluded that mind was a non-physical substance. The mind is distinct and separate from the body because the body is a material and physical substance. Now, this mind-body dualism has been repeated and revised throughout Western thought. The mind has generally been considered to be an immaterial seat of consciousness, thought, and reason, while the body, on the other hand, is a thoroughly material, earthy, physical entity. The body is the seat of the senses, of feelings, of emotions, of the passions, as they were known in the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, within the West, the mind is typically valued above the body. This stance was solidified during the Enlightenment period, when philosophers made reason into the basis for morality, democracy, and freedom. Most influential was Immanuel Kant. For Kant, the body was the site of pathological influences, appetites, and base desires. The mind, also an immaterial site, was the site of reason and of freedom. Now, freedom, according to Kant, was evident in the capacity of humans to act from non-bodily immaterial causes. Okay, so for example, let's say I'm hungry and I don't have money to buy food. My bodily appetites might incline me to steal that food. But I can stop myself from stealing out of respect for a higher moral principle, something like thou shalt not steal. Now, this principle, this moral principle, it's immaterial. It doesn't originate within my body. And yet, this immaterial cause allows me to move my body against its own kind of natural bodily appetites. And so to put things very, very crudely, my body will say yes to its appetites, but my mind can say no. Okay. For Kant, this is the basis of moral action. It's the exercise of freedom from our own bodily influences through the use of reason. And so here we see the mind-body dualism kind of being extremely stark here, right? The mind is the seat of reason, which for Kant is the basis of freedom and morality, and our bodies are just the seats of like base desires, okay? That's where we have a lot of things in common with animals, for example. Now, this esteem that's been given to mind and reason has been gendered and racialized. During the Enlightenment, women were deemed inferior to men because of their supposedly lower rational capacities and their high susceptibility to emotions. Women were thus denied the right to political participation because the public sphere was supposed to be a place of rational discourse. This is something that's very much present in politics today. A lot of people will not vote for a woman to be president of the United States, for example, because they are concerned that she would be too overwhelmed by emotions to conduct that office in a cool, calm, rational manner. And similarly, Native peoples in Africa and the Americas were deemed to lack capacities for reason altogether. They were believed to be primitive, uncivilized, savage, and animal-like. This view supported European campaigns of land theft, enslavement, and genocide from the late 15th century onwards, and these views continue to be widespread today. But as this strand of Western thought has unfolded, there have been significant efforts to assign value to feelings and to the body. So for this talk, I want to elevate the work of women, especially the work of women of color. I turn now to the poet and scholar, Audre Lorde. According to Audre Lorde, white heteropatriarchy suppresses the feelings of Black and brown women. And Lorde doesn't mince any words on this point. She writes, "For within living structures defined by profit, by linear power, by institutional dehumanization, our feelings were not meant to survive. Kept around as unavoidable adjuncts or pleasant pastimes, feelings were expected to kneel to thought as women were expected to kneel to men." Within this context, Lorde believes in the power of feelings. Directly referencing Descartes, Lorde writes, "The white fathers told us, 'I think, therefore I am.' The Black mother within each of us, the poet, whispers in our dreams, 'I feel, therefore I can be free.'" Feelings for Lorde are not the impediment to freedom that Kant imagined them to be. According to her, feelings are actually the very material of freedom because they summon the energy to push for a very different world. Now, this is especially clear in the feeling that Lorde calls the erotic. The Greek notion of eros means immense love. Lorde elaborates the erotic as creative energy and as a life force. The erotic designates our capacity for joy and our ability to share joy with others. For Lorde, it's a self-affirming and a community-affirming kind of feeling. According to Lorde, the erotic is important because it serves as a measure for all aspects of life. She writes, "For once we begin to feel deeply all aspects of our lives, we begin to demand from ourselves and from our life pursuits that they feel in accordance with that joy which we know ourselves to be capable of. Our erotic knowledge empowers us, becomes the lens through which we scrutinize all aspects of our existence, forcing us to evaluate those aspects honestly in terms of their relative meaning within our lives. And this is a grave responsibility projected from within each of us, not to settle for the convenient, the shoddy, the conventionally expected, nor the merely safe." Then Lorde continues, "In touch with the erotic, I become less willing to accept powerlessness or those other supplied states of being which are not native to me, such as resignation, despair, self-effacement, depression, self-denial." Now, what's important here is that Lorde points out that these latter feelings, such as despair and depression, they're not natural, and they don't originate from within us. According to Lorde, these feelings result from a world that's designed against our survival. The erotic emboldens us to build another world, and in this manner, the erotic is a revolutionary political resource. Now, Audre Lorde has been deeply influential, so I want to turn now to one line of her legacy, contemporary feminist thought on emotions that goes by the name of public feelings. Now, the Public Feelings Group is composed of scholars in feminist and queer studies. It emerged in 2001 in response to national grief, outrage, and aggression in the emerging war on terror. They would do things like hold these protests and make signs like "Day of the Politically Depressed" and "Don't just medicate, agitate." Okay, prescription, resist. The group sought to understand the role of affect, feelings, and emotions in political life. They have also described the ways in which gender, sexuality, and race are involved in making distinctions between public and private spheres. According to them, a society that prizes ideas and reason over feelings and emotions turns feelings into merely personal and private matters. It's not simply that feelings are excluded from the public sphere, it's that the public sphere emerges on account of the exclusion of feelings. Okay. Now, public feeling scholars challenge these assumptions. rather than separating mind and body, as has been done in much of Western thought. They emphasize the interconnectedness of mind and body. Rather than privileging reason over emotion, they not only find that reason is supported by emotions, but that emotion also has its own rationality. In short, public feeling scholars produce knowledge about emotions, and they show that emotions produce knowledge. Now, as the name entails, public feeling scholars emphasize that feelings are not personal and not private. They're interested in the feelings that are generated by politics and publics, and they are especially interested in how feelings circulate publicly. For these scholars, publics are not just spaces outside the home. They're any form of community and exchange. You might think of political protests, teach-ins, reading groups, artist talks, social media apps like Discord or Clubhouse, discussion boards, and town halls. Okay, these are all examples of publics. And these scholars insist that feelings are important components of public life. You might think, for example, of grief and outrage in the wake of anti-Asian violence in the United States over the past year. While these feelings have been experienced very personally for many Asians and Asian Americans, they have also been the substance of publics that have emerged, such as candlelight vigils and Stop AAPI hate rallies. Okay, those are all publics in which feelings are front and center. Finally, public feeling scholars view feelings to be political, okay? So they're generated by power, and they can also be a political resource. Now, as an example of public feeling scholarships, we might turn to Anne Cvetkovich's book, Depression, A Public Feeling, in which Cvetkovich describes depression as intensely felt, but that doesn't mean that it's a personal or private emotion. According to Cvetkovich, depression is both a political feeling and a public mood. Her ultimate aim in the book is to de-individualize, deprivatize, and depathologize depression. Okay? And she is especially interested in the relationship between depression and racism in the United States. She writes, "What if depression, in the Americas at least, could be traced to histories of colonialism, genocide, slavery, legal exclusion, and everyday segregation and isolation that haunt all of our lives, rather than to biochemical imbalances?" Okay. In other words, depression is one effect of racism. And moreover, because racism is a systemic rather than intermittent affair, depression also can be systemic. It is not a temporary experience in an otherwise normal and happy life. Depression for racialized peoples may be entirely ordinary and ongoing. Recalling Audre Lorde's insight that depression is not native to ourselves, Cvetkovich shows that depression and mental health more generally are entirely social and political. Now, public feeling scholarship has been influential for many academics and many writers. One of them is the poet Cathy Park Hong. I turn to her work now on minor feelings to further illustrate the racialized and gendered dimensions of feelings in publics and to explore the affective dimensions of anti-Asian racism. So Cathy Park Hong's book, Minor Feelings in Asian American Reckoning, describes struggles faced by Asian Americans in the United States. We Asian Americans are forced to live what she calls a conditional existence. That is, we're forced to live in relation to whiteness, which frames us as both model minorities and as enemy aliens. As philosopher Boram Jung observes, we are alternately made invisible and hypervisible depending on the needs of whiteness. Asian Americans are thus at a critical juncture. We can either accept the dominance of whiteness, strive to assimilate to white culture, and aspire for upward mobility within a system of racial capitalism, even if that means beating down other racialized groups and each other. Or we can tear down white supremacy and racial capitalism by developing cross-racial alliances that are accountable to history rather than ignorant of it. Now, this predicament is not easily resolved, according to Hong, because it's emotionally tense. This predicament generates what Hong calls minor feelings, or the racialized range of emotions that are negative, dysphoric, and therefore untelegenic, built from the sediments of everyday racial experience and the irritant of having one's perception of reality constantly questioned or dismissed. And note the description of emotions as racialized. Hong is saying that emotions are not natural or apolitical, but that minor feelings are the residue of a racist social system. So how exactly do minor feelings come about? Well, because our existence is conditional, our feelings are conditional as well. Like Audre Lorde, Hong finds that American society closes any space for public expressions of our feelings. This is because the hegemony of American optimism is threatened by any trace of negativity. As journalist Barbara Ehrenreich has shown in her book Bright-Sided, American culture long has been dominated by a regime of positive thinking. Hong shows that criticisms of American narratives about progress are typically disallowed in dominant public cultures. She writes that minor feelings occur when American optimism is enforced upon you, which contradicts your own racialized reality, thereby creating a static of cognitive dissonance. You are told things are so much better while you think things are the same. You are told Asian Americans are so successful while you feel like a failure. The feelings of people of color and women of color are excluded in order for the whiteness of public space and public discourse to be maintained. One recent example of this is a set of controversial statements from Harvard's Counseling and Mental Health Services, we'll just call them CAMS, on its website for anti-Asian racism resources. Now, this website was made in March 2020 in the wake of rising anti-Asian sentiment in the US. And this website was also disseminated in the wake of the Atlanta shootings on the March 17th of this year. Harvard student Mateo Wong tweeted about the statements on March 30, and the thread went viral. A public of outrage emerged in its wake. This public illustrated American pragmatist John Dewey's belief that a public is not based on either a shared identity or a shared set of interests. According to Dewey, publics emerge in response to a problem that generates a shared sense of harm. So what was the source of outrage with Harvard? Aside from clearly them using a T-set on this website for anti-Asian racism resources. Well, one of the tools offered for coping with racial discrimination read, find pride in your community. When you experience racism, you can feel shame. You may wish that you weren't Asian, but remember that your ancestors likely went through similar or even worse incidents. Now, much critical attention has been given to the line, you may wish you weren't Asian. That line simplifies and invalidates the complex, painful feelings generated by anti-Asian racism. And it also makes the source of the problem being Asian rather than stuff like white supremacy. But another problematic point is what follows, and this is what I want to focus on. Remember that your ancestors likely went through similar or even worse incidents. Now, this is an example of what Ehrenreich calls the regime of positive thinking. This statement gives the impression that because your ancestors survived far worse than you, and I don't think that's a safe assumption to make, by the way, that your ancestors survived. Well, it gives the impression that your experiences and your feelings are not as painful. You have it easier. Your feelings are not valid. What this line sets up is a kind of progressivist storyline whereby social situations magically improve over time. And it's this kind of positive, upbeat spin that dismisses what literary scholar Cheyenne calls ugly feelings. Okay, and you see this right at the end of that tool, right? Put your communities in a positive light. Now, when a public began to gather around this offensive material, Harvard ended up continuing to sideline Asians and Asian Americans. Mateo Wong later tweeted, they changed it, meaning they deleted the photo and the several offending paragraphs. Too much to ask for apology or acknowledgement? Probably. Just minor feelings, I guess. Although an apology was soon released, this moment is instructive. The deletion of the offensive material without acknowledgement also deleted space for the feelings that they generated. It served to stop a public of outrage and dissent and criticism from emerging. In doing so, the deletion replicated the very condition that it may have sought to rectify, a condition of isolation, compartmentalization, and containment. The apology itself can be seen as initiating a different public, one that is focused on Harvard's intentions to do better rather than the harm that it generated. In short, Harvard's response was not inserted into a pre-existing public. It opened a new public through the closure of another. And this is really what's at the heart of minor feelings. Minor feelings are created by the willful manipulation of publics and public discourse to maintain an acceptable range of feelings that ultimately reinforce whiteness. When developing the concept of minor feelings, Hong focuses on the American publishing industry. The industry accepts minoritarian writers only within certain carefully tailored constraints. According to Hong, writers must prove their own humanity to an audience that is presumed to be white. They are forced to do so by displaying their pain and their trauma, and by showing that they have a resilience that can overcome all hardship. Now, this is the genre of sentimentality, which came to dominance in 19th century American literature. We see this in novels such as Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, for instance. Now, sentimentalist literature puts on grand display feelings of, or grand displays of feeling because they supposedly unveil the truth of a person. Pain, for instance, is held to be a universally shared feeling. If the minoritized can show their pain clearly enough, dominant groups will supposedly feel empathy and compassion. So moved, they would recognize the humanity of the minoritized and grant rights and privileges that were formerly denied. Okay. Now that might sound like a good thing, but literary critics such as Lauren Berlant, Dana Luciano, and Keela Schuler have all shown that sentimentality actually reproduces social hierarchies rather than dismantles them. This is because sentimentality fortifies white norms of feelings, of visuality, of narration, and representation. Okay. Whiteness still shapes the very notion of the human and humanity that sentimentality thinks that we can gain access to. And Hong emphasizes a similar point. In contrast with Descartes, she writes, for Asian Americans, it's not I think, therefore I am. It's I don't think, therefore I am. I hurt, therefore I am. Under whiteness, Asian Americans may be a subject, may be an I, only by not thinking. That is, only by feeling pain and only by demonstrating it to a broader public. And think about this bind. If I exist only because I hurt, does that mean that I am more real when I experience more pain? If so, then let's take this to its most extreme conclusion. I am most real when I cease to exist because of overwhelming pain. That's the predicament that Asians and Asian Americans are in the United States. Hong is illustrating what political theorist Wendy Brown has called wounded attachments, which compose a predicament where claims to rights end up being self-defeating because identity is defined through injury. Sentimentality is disempowering because it demands self-mutilation and a parade of trauma. It demands the replacement of you and your flesh and blood by a hologram that has been designed by whiteness. But the feelings excluded from dominant publics don't disappear. They remain, they're intense, and they're vivid. Minor feelings are not minor in and of themselves, but they are made minor by a dominant public culture that holds no space for them. Minor feelings are those that are forcibly compartmentalized, denied, and derealized. And all of this is to protect American optimism. If minor feelings hurt, and if minor feelings are the byproduct of American optimism, then American optimism is a factory of injury, pain, trauma. But can there be publics that are defined by more than harm and injury, by attachments that are not wounded, but that stem from care? Queer theorist Jose Esteban Munoz supplements John Dewey's notion of publics. He says, yes, publics are constituted by shared harms, but they're also constituted by shared flourishing. So in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to explore a couple of projects that address harm by giving public space to minor feelings and by seeking to build a world of shared mutual flourishing. Now, the first project that I will focus on is called Open in Emergency, which was a special issue of the Asian American Literary Review, edited by scholar Mimi Cook, and originally published in 2016. Sponsored by Binghamton University, the Asian American Literary Review is not a big publishing company like, say, Penguin Random House. It has broader discretion over what it publishes and the expectations of its writers. Typically, the journal publishes poetry, fiction, creative nonfiction, and reviews of books. And the issues tend to be wildly creative, like Open in Emergency was. Now, the theme of Open in Emergency was Asian American mental health. The contributors included scholars, activists, artists, poets, and community organizers, which is very unusual for an academic journal. The issue consists of a hacked diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, a testimonial tapestry, a pamphlet on postpartum depression, a set of daughter-to-mother letters, and a tarot cards deck whose major arcana are archetypical figures of Asian America, such as the model minority, the ancestor, and the refugee. Open in Emergency does not have any central structure or core identity. It's composed of multiple perspectives, narratives, and aesthetics. So it's a public gathered around a problem of mental health, and around the shared ambition to survive and thrive. It's an ensemble of fragments, a kaleidoscope of visions, a community of minor feelings. Now, Cook's editor's note takes the form of a letter to her daughter. It elaborates the implications of minor feelings for mental health. Cook writes, "My child, the world makes us sick and then tells us it is our fault. Sickness as individual pathology, a lack of ability or will to achieve wellness. The world tells us what wellness looks like, marks it as normal, moral. Like whiteness, wellness as an ideal to strive for, a state of being in constant performance. Invisibilized structures holding up bodies and persons, certain bodies, certain persons. Invisibilized structures tearing apart other bodies, other persons. Like Anne Spekovich, Cook treats unwellness as a lens through which to interpret the world. It's not a mirror of ourselves. In other words, mental health can tell us a lot about the world in which we live, whether it cares for us, nurtures us, supports us, or whether it disparages us, abandons us, leaves us to rot and die. Now, Cook shows that the generation of minor feelings has significant impacts on mental health, and she traces the loops of the damage. First, there's the damage of a white supremacist capitalist society. Then there is social gaslighting, which attributes damage to minoritized individuals rather than to systemic injustice, and then denies that anything is wrong. Third, because mental health is treated as individual pathology, white supremacist capitalist society dismantles resources and support structures. And finally, this abandonment causes another layer of damage. People don't have anywhere to go to receive the care that they need. And that harm then feeds back into the first phase, and the cycle spirals out of control. To break that cycle, Cook holds space for minor feelings. This thing called life is no joke, my sweet child. It's okay to hurt. We must allow ourselves to hurt, to trace the losses, the heartbreak, the death. We must allow ourselves to be whole people in all our brokenness. Our lives, as always negotiating violence, trauma, crises of meaning. Our lives as always finding new ways of making meaning, making community. I tell you this to free you, but to also show you how to allow others to be free. Like Audre Lorde, Cook holds space for our pain in a society that hurts us and that denies that it ever did. By giving space to minor feelings, Cook helps us all to be free, free of whiteness, free of capitalism's ruthless devaluing of life, free within, though not necessarily from, histories that are ongoing and that still hurt. Now, the second resource is a project of mine called the Corner of Heart to Hearts. Now, the central presumption of the corner is that we all have deep emotional experiences that are significant for who we are, but that we rarely talk about. And you can think about the corner as almost like a game or kind of exercise that you do with people. People sit together with a deck of cards, and each card has an emotion on it, such as regret, embarrassment, triumph, or dream. A card is drawn at random. And then participants take turns sharing a memory, experience, or story that comes to mind. So the goal of the corner is to build intimacy between people, even if they are strangers. This is what makes the corner feminist and queer in nature. It privileges conversation about feelings, and it emphasizes forms of intimacy that are not defined by romance or kinship or even friendship. Because the corner offers a chance to have intimate conversation with someone you've never even met before and who you may never see again. So the corner is meant to be a minor public of sorts. The corner originated in late 2015 when I was in graduate school. One night I was hanging out with friends, a group of cis male friends, I should say, from the same graduate program at a bar. And typically we would talk about readings and schoolwork, we're real nerdy types. But that night, for some reason, the conversation was different. We ended up talking about various issues in our deeply personal lives, and we have never had a conversation like that before. And I think that's when I was in the program for like 6 years. So It was that long that we never had a personal conversation like that. And that conversation felt freeing to me. And I went to bed that night glowing. And I found this gem when looking through my Facebook feed, heart to hearts with the poli-sci boys, OMG, the feels, I want to cry, I love you all. That's how good I felt back then. And it was a very different time. But the next morning, I woke up and I was obsessed with the desire to intentionally reproduce that kind of conversation. How can we foster this in our everyday lives? Coincidentally, there was a friend whose birthday party was that night. And I remember that I would always feel awkward, anxious, and overwhelmed at these parties. It's very weird having to see people and talk with them. So could there be a way to connect with others? I often wondered, what if this idea that we're, budding up for me, what if it was a game about connecting with people? I happened to have a stack of index cards nearby, and I wrote an emotion on each one. I took the deck to the party that night, where I set up a tiny table in a tiny corner. I placed a candle and a lighter there. To hype things up, I placed caution tape around the corner and posted a start time of 11 p.m. When people trickled into the party, they wondered what this was all about. What is this corner? What's going to happen? I explained the idea to a few of them. The men were predictably skeptical of this idea, but they eventually were game. When the time came, I started the corner. Friends came around, I learned new things about them. And strangers also came by, and surprisingly, they opened up about things like childhood traumas, drug addictions, the works. I ended up running the corner that night for 6.5 hours. And if you recall, it started off at 11 at night, so I was talking for a long time. During grad school, I did the corner at 2 other parties. I posted about the corner on Facebook, and a friend of mine, Lawrence Min Bowie Davis, took notice. Davis is co-editor of the Asian American Literary Review and a curator at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. We'll call it APAC for short. Davis and I had a conversation about the corner, and he invited me to contribute to the piece to open an emergency. Later on, he also invited me to bring the corner to a Smithsonian APAC Culture Lab. Culture Lab is a kind of pop-up exhibition of art, performance, poetry, community building. APAC doesn't have its own exhibition space, so it took to organizing cultural labs in different cities in the United States. It had one in Washington, DC, one in New York City, and one in Honolulu, Hawaii. The one Davis invited me to was the culture lab on imagined futures called Control Alt. Over 30 artists, performers, scholars, poets were invited to put together a 2-day culture lab in New York City. Now, Control Alt happened to be on the weekend after Donald Trump was elected president. Many of us knew that Trump would be awful, but at that very early stage, we had yet to see how far he would exceed our worst expectations in the years to come. But still, in the days after the election, dread, depression, and defeat were thick public feelings that hung over New York City. They made Control Alt's theme of imagined futures even more urgent. Now, the challenge for me was designing the corner of Heart to Hearts as a physical space. I mean, you saw the previous iteration and how like do it yourself it was. And Davis encouraged me to build an environment that would transport people to another world. So I took to making these sketches. I thought that, well, within the exhibition space, we could have these different corners that would be marked off by partitions. Maybe the partitions could be translucent to give a sense of its own space, but also not to be as standoffish as a closed off wall or barrier. And I would end up falling very short of Davis's proposal due to a lack of preparations and budget constraints. You see, it's still pretty DIY. One thing I didn't know was how expensive it would be to rent out like piping and stuff to actually get, these partitions made. But This is what the space looked like in the exhibit. You can see that there are several tables in the corners that were for this kind of corner of heart to hearts. On the lower left-hand side of the image, you can see a longer table that ended up being a more community table for conversations and whatnot. And in the background, you can see a post-election refuge that was a kind of last-minute idea because again, the election just happened. Now, Davis also paired me with illustrator Yumi Sakugawa, whose own work on mindfulness resonates strongly with my own. Together, Sakugawa and I co-authored a zine, designed postcards and coloring sheets. And oh, I almost forgot that, yeah, people actually came out despite the very crude nature of the setup. And, I was very encouraged to see, people really engage the corner. And here's an image of the cover of the zine that Sakugawa and I created together. And if you like, she also made a sticker set for iMessage that you can download from the App Store for free if you want to do heart-to-hearts, over text or something. Now, it's my hope that the corner of heart-to-hearts can give space to minor feelings. The space is important for everyone, but for Asians and Asian Americans in particular. And this is especially because of the ongoing wave of anti-Asian sentiment. Mainstream media has only covered the most spectacular acts of violence, such as the Atlanta shootings, and has given very little attention to all of the other incidents of abuse, of humiliation, and of targeting that we've seen over the past year. There's been little public space to address anti-Asian racism, so there's been little public space for our feelings. I hope that the corner can give Asians and Asian Americans an outlet and a refuge of care. And now to wrap up this talk, I'm briefly going to scale up from the corner to discuss how care might better inform our society and politics. I'm very much inspired by a recent publication called the Care Manifesto, written by the Care Collective. In this book, the collective undertakes the monumental task of centering care across multiple sites: families, communities, municipalities, nations, and up to the planet itself. The collective argues that the COVID-19 pandemic has clearly illustrated our society's failure to provide care, not only during the pandemic, but also before it. As they write, carelessness continues to reign. And this is for several reasons. First of all, care is gendered. Caregiving is held to be women's work. And likewise, receiving care is interpreted as a sign of weakness and dependency. So it's feminized. Second, neoliberal capitalism has devalued care because it's held to be unprofitable. Neoliberal capitalism places the responsibility for care entirely within the private sector. It dismantles social structures and leaves those who cannot afford care utterly abandoned. And the third source of carelessness has been right-wing populist and authoritarian movements. These movements have been rising in response to the immiseration of neoliberal capitalism. And they've responded by giving promises of restoration and belonging by pinpointing groups to blame for economic downfalls. These movements restrict care to quote unquote worthy ethnic and racial groups and make care dependent on the extermination of others. The Care Collective argues that care needs to be reimagined, and this care has two main attributes. First, it's universal. It's not restricted to the private sphere. This form of care belongs everywhere, from the home all the way up to the planet. Next, everyone is responsible for caregiving. Caregiving is about giving direct aid to people and the maintenance of social infrastructures that enable further care work to continue. And finally, universal care will require an affirmation of our interdependency. We can't think of ourselves as autonomous, self-sufficient individuals. Second, care has to be promiscuous. This means that we can't reserve it only for those people who are most close to us and most familiar. We have to give it to familiars and strangers alike. When that's the case, Care will involve people who are very different from us, people with different needs, wants, desires, and capacities. So we can't merely design one model of care that will encompass everyone. We must cultivate greater sensitivity to people's different wants, needs, capacities, and limits. And that means care has to be experimental by design. The Corner of Heart to Hearts enacts this form of universal promiscuous care. It affirms interdependency, vulnerability, and mutuality. It can be scaled up to larger clusters of people or scaled down to an individual dialoguing with themselves. And of course, the corner has numerous limits. Any project does. The corner is just one tiny link in a chain of much needed social and political projects, such as mutual aid, community organizing, and political protest. So I offer the corner and this talk really not as an answer, but as an invitation to co-build communities of public feelings. Our principle would not be, I think, therefore I am. In the face of anti-Asian violence, the damage of white supremacy and racial capitalism, the gendering and racialization of publics and privates, our vital principle might be, we care, therefore we survive. Thank you.